Have you ever had one of those games that you remember playing quite a lot as a kid, but you never actually finished? Maybe you got near to the end and got stuck, or maybe you never even made it very far in the first place and can't remember the exact reason why you stopped. Well, for me, one of these games is Rascal for the PS1. Despite owning it since the 2nd of May 1998, I don't ever remember finishing the second level. The reason I can be so specific about when I got this is because I actually have some home video of the birthday where I received it, but little did I know that I would never finish it. That is, until now, because 24 years later, I'm finally gonna finish this thing. And while I'm at it, I also want to try and find out why I never got very far in it in the first place. So, join me on this journey as we find out what Rascal is all about. Right off the bat, I might know something that put me off of Rascal, because the opening of the game is really quite weird. It has this pretty terrifying vibe to it, which is created through several different things. Firstly, the cutscene is generally quite dark, being set in some kind of underground tunnels. Secondly, the story here is about Rascal's scientist father being kidnapped, and then Rascal himself being chased by these weird flying alien things. But by far the most scary aspect of this situation is the person doing the kidnapping. He's this absolutely grotesque monster with these weird long green spindly arms and a distorted human face that looks so out of place with the rest of the game's visuals that it creates this extremely unnerving feeling. This is quite genuinely probably the scariest looking villain that I've ever seen in a platformer. Another odd thing about this cutscene is that these aliens that chase Rascal down are literally never seen in the game ever again. They're not boss characters or standard enemies or anything. They only appear in this one cutscene, which again creates this weird disjointed feeling between the actual game and the opening cutscene. There's just something about this that feels really off, and it ends up being quite creepy. Not only does the cutscene have a really weird vibe to it though, but it also doesn't actually do a very good job of explaining the story. Like, we see this scientist guy getting kidnapped, but we have no idea who he is, or even who Rascal is. We could have done with a bit more of a setup here to put everyone's personalities across and actually explain what's going on. In order to get the full story, we need to consult the manual, which explains that the horrible looking bad guy is called Chronon, and he's an evil time overlord who kidnaps Professor Casper Clockwise and his plans for a time travelling vessel in order to rule over the planet by distorting the past. Rascal witnesses this kidnapping and takes matters into his own hands by picking up a bubble gun invention that his father was working on and uses time portals to go back and fix everything before any permanent damage is done. The manual also goes into a bit of side information about Rascal too, showing us his school report card where teachers have written notes about his performance in several different subjects. And also there's a pretty detailed bio about him too, where it states stuff like his best friend, Nicky Dent from across the road, his favourite phrase, which is "cool it," and even his favourite film, which is Men in Black. That's actually pretty funny because on the exact same birthday that I got Rascal, I also got a ton of Men in Black stuff too. Like the Men in Black VHS and some Men in Black toys. Who knew me and Rascal had so much in common? Does anyone else think that the character design, especially for the main character, is a little bit questionable? Like, I get that they were trying to make him relatable by having him be a normal human character, but this is the most overly cool 90s kid I think I've ever seen. With his backwards baseball cap, his shades that he's constantly wearing, even in the dark, and his oversized t-shirt. He just doesn't really have any unique personality, and I feel like just looking at him as he is now, he could have just have been a low-budget cereal mascot or something. I think that they were probably just trying way too hard to make a cool character, and ended up making the most generic-looking thing that you could possibly imagine. The main menu here is fairly basic, but it is interesting in the way that it smoothly transitions from the menu to the actual gameplay, which I think is an interesting touch. The options menu also looks quite cool, looking like it's displayed on a futuristic screen with a sciencey feel to it, which fits with the whole vibe of the game. I also really like how you save and load the game by going into a different room of the house. It feels like it was trying to be quite immersive with this, and I love little details like this in games. Now, most of you watching this video are probably well aware of Rascal's legacy. It's one of those games that are considered to be very bad, and people often make videos on it with the title of the worst PlayStation game ever made and stuff like that. But what I want to find out is if there's actually any truth to that, or is there something in Rascal that actually makes it stand out? Well, first of all, I really like the idea of the hub world here being Rascal's house. You start the game in your room, then you can go and save in your dad's room, or go downstairs where you enter the proper levels through time portals. At the start of the game, a lot of doors will be locked and you need to complete a certain level to unlock coloured keys, which then allow you to enter new parts of the house and find brand new levels there. Just like with the opening cutscene though, there's this super weird uncanny feeling you get here. Like, all of the doors in the house are really short, Rascal himself can only just fit through them, but then the stairs are absolutely huge in comparison to Rascal, and it makes it feel like nothing here is quite right, even though you're in a normal looking house. It's almost like it's a house that Alice would have gone into in Wonderland or something. Add to that the sort of weird atmosphere created by this clock constantly ticking, and you've got something that wouldn't feel out of place in some kind of psychological horror game. It's really weird. The first proper level of the game is set in a castle, and the music here hit me right in the nostalgia bone. Anyone that's played this game before has got to remember this track. The objective in every level is to find the 6 timepieces in order to activate an exit portal and get back home. The timepieces can be hidden in plain sight, or they can be obtained by defeating a certain enemy. But things aren't too simple because we also need to find 3 coloured keys which open the corresponding coloured doors. The levels here consist of lots of separate rooms connected by doors, and because they fairly often split off in multiple directions, things can start to feel a little bit maze-like. To the game's credit though, there is enough variety in the way that the rooms look for you to not completely lose your bearings all the time, and it also helps that all of the levels are reasonably short too. However, I do have to admit that this maze design does become really stale very quickly, and there's not really any other gameplay styles to break up the monotony of it. An interesting thing with Rascal is that there's actually no real main or even optional collectibles. You know how in Crash Bandicoot you can go for the boxes to get gems, or in Super Mario 64 you get power stars by completing objectives? Well, in Rascal you get the timepieces to exit the level, but there's no overarching collectible to get, and there's no optional things to go for either to achieve 100%. Effectively, this means that there's very little replay value, because by finishing the game a single time, you've fully completed it and there's nothing else to do. Even if you wanted to replay a level, you're actually locked out of doing so once you've finished it for the first time. It's almost like the game doesn't want you to play it more than one time, and I can't think of a single other game in this generation that does this. Like, sure, Super Mario Bros. On the NES doesn't have a main collectible either, but it does have a score system as well as a harder mode to go through once you've finished it for the first time. So in a lot of ways, Rascal feels even more dated and more sort of empty than even an NES game does. It's not even like the game does anything interesting to get around this either. Like, it could have had some level of interactivity with the environments, where you could read books or signs which explain some lore about the locations you visit and the enemies you encounter or something. Kinda like how in Medieval you can go up to these books which give you information about where you are and stuff. But Rascal simply doesn't do that. Even when there are signs in the game, you actually can't read them, and it's frustrating because the manual has all of these really cool and detailed bios for all of the enemies in the game, and you just don't see any of that in the game itself. It's such a missed opportunity. All of these issues with the game's structure wouldn't actually be too much of a problem though if the game itself was fun. After all, sometimes a game just being outright fun is enough of a reason to want to replay it constantly, even without any sort of in-game incentive to do so. But the issue is, Rascal is also littered with a ton of other problems that make the game really difficult to enjoy. The most obvious thing that Rascal doesn't get right is a combination of the controls and the camera. Not only are we dealing with tank controls here, but to add to that, this is probably one of the single worst cameras that I've ever used in a platformer. So yeah, Rascal has tank controls, but that's no big deal on its own. Games that I absolutely love, like the original Croc, use tank controls too, but I can adapt to them and pull off precise jumps with ease. But the difference between a game like Croc and a game like Rascal is that in Croc they give you way more abilities to manipulate your movement. So in Croc, you can quick turn, you can move the camera to different positions, you can do side steps while on the ground, and while you're in the air, you can actually rotate yourself left and right in order to position yourself better. Rascal, meanwhile, literally does none of this. I mean, you can't even quick turn for God's sake. So even just doing the simplest of tasks like walking from one end of a corridor and going around a corner just feels terrible. Maybe if the tank controls were the only issue here though, this wouldn't actually be that bad. But what takes things to a whole new level of pain is the camera. Every single time you enter a door to get into a new area, the camera is placed facing you and has to do this sort of awkward swinging around in order to face the direction that you actually want to move. This means that literally every single time you enter a new area, you're completely blind for a good few seconds and you can't see where you're going or if there's any enemies in the area or anything. Some rooms that you enter are also extremely cramped, so the camera is unable to swing around to the correct position at all, and you end up playing the game with the camera facing a wall for the whole area, obviously taking a ton of damage and potentially losing lives too. It's not even like they took the camera into consideration here either. Some of these areas that you enter are just absolutely rammed with obstacles, and I don't really understand how they expected anybody to actually get through this without getting hit. To say that there's literally no camera control though is a little bit unfair, because you can actually press L2 to make the camera go lower. This never actually comes in handy, but hey, you can do it. A much more helpful function is that you can press R2 and the camera will rotate around you, but it only does this in one direction, and if there's a wall in the way, the camera can't go through it and it'll just get stuck. Bear in mind that there's very few areas in the game that are actually open enough to utilize this, and you'll quickly see why this is basically a useless mechanic. Why the hell they didn't make L2 rotate the camera in the opposite direction, I've got no idea. Like, if you want to look over to your right without rotating yourself in that direction and walking a little bit to get the camera to actually follow you, you'd need to rotate the camera all the way clockwise around yourself to actually see what you want to look at. It's honestly absolutely abysmal, and the constant camera swinging and bad manual camera controls was a constant issue through the entire game. It even somewhat ruins the cool concept of the transition from the main menu to the gameplay, because the camera sort of freaks out a bit and lands in this awkward position where you can't see what you're doing. Like, who programmed this and thought, yeah, this is how the game should start? Literally the first thing you do in the entire game is you sit there and you need to piss about correcting the camera. As you can probably expect, the combat in the game is pretty awful as well. Your main method of attack is using the bubble gun, which you aim simply by rotating Rascal on the spot, and you shoot by pressing square. There's no locking on or first person aiming for accuracy or anything, and again, this probably wouldn't have been too bad if it had just been this which was the problem. But on top of this very basic combat is the fact that almost every single enemy in the game will will react in the exact same way. They'll see you and then they'll run at you, and then they'll attempt to just walk into you, which deals some damage. That's it. So the strategy to beat all of the enemies just becomes spot an enemy and mash the square button while moving backwards away from them. And that will get you through 99% of this game's combat. It's just so underbaked that it's ridiculous. The enemies literally might as well not even be there. Some of the more unique enemies, like for example this dragon that's found in the depths of the castle level, are more difficult to defeat. With this, you need to run around in circles waiting for its flame breath to stop before letting off a few shots to deal some damage. Not only is this extremely clunky to pull off though, thanks to the god-awful controls and camera combination, but also the dragon doesn't really react to any of your shots, meaning that for a while I was wondering if it was even possible to beat it, and you know what? When you eventually do kill it after absolutely ages of running around in circles avoiding lava and flame breath, you get rewarded with a big fat pile of bugger all. That's right, this completely unique and difficult enemy that actually functions in a somewhat interesting way doesn't even need to be defeated. What the hell is that about? It could have at the very least have given you a 1-up. The only sort of real complexity to the game's combat system is that you can run out of ammo, and this can be refilled by collecting these gun icons spread throughout the levels. If you do run out of ammo though, all this does is reduces the range of your bubbles. It doesn't actually prevent you from shooting, and it doesn't even reduce the damage you do either. So really, this actually isn't too much of a hindrance. You also have access to a stomp attack, but this is only really used to beat the little enemies littered throughout the game, and this is another annoying thing that makes me question the developers' intentions. So the way that these little enemies work is that if you spend too long in a particular room, little rats, bats, snakes and stuff like that will start randomly spawning in. Killing these has a chance of making them drop an item, which can consist of helpful stuff like ammo or health, but it can also make an item spawn in which literally just hurts you for no good reason. I mean, I would argue that these little enemies constantly spawning into the level is completely unnecessary anyway. Why are we being forced to rush through the entire game when its core design seems to be about exploration? But to add in the chance that killing one of these enemies will result in you taking damage anyway, just feels like they were taking the mick. Luckily, if you do end up dying and losing a life, you actually just respawn from the start of the room you're in, and you even get to keep all of the collectibles that you've previously got in that room too. So you don't actually ever lose any progress by dying. That is unless you lose all of your lives, I assume, in which case you probably need to start the whole level again. But being the pro gamer that I am, this never happened to me. I can definitely see why people refer to this game as being bad, and I can also now see why I myself never got very far in this game either. I mean, I could have been put off by any number of things. The weirdly scary atmosphere, the fact that the game is designed like a maze and maybe I just couldn't find my way forward, or maybe I was constantly game overing thanks to the camera, controls, and constantly spawning enemies. Or hey, maybe it was a combination of all of those things that put me off. But even after having said all of that, I'm still determined to find some sort of silver lining here. So, what's actually good about Rascal? Well, you know what, as much as the core design of the game absolutely sucks, I will give the developers credit with the actual concept behind the level progression here. The way that the game works is that you go back in time and play through a standard level, collecting the timepieces, returning home and unlocking a key to enter a new level. However, if you enter a level that you've already completed, you're actually taken to the same level but how it is in present day. This leads to some really interesting situations where, for example, the castle, which was previously filled with knights and dragons and lava pits, is now a museum where all of the enemies you previously encountered are recreated as statues as part of an exhibit. And the enemies this time around are instead security guards and a laser alarm system. There's even this really cool bit where you deactivate the lasers by turning the security system into daytime mode, but by doing that you also inadvertently activate some animatronics that look like the enemies that you fought in the past. That's actually pretty cool, and it was always really interesting playing through the same level designs but from a completely new perspective. The last level of the game has to be my favourite for this, because it starts out as this old west cowboy themed level, which is actually the best level of the whole game because it feels like you're exploring a real place rather than just a series of rooms. But then when you go back there in the present day, it turns into this film set where you start in a cowboy area, but then you go through loads of differently themed areas, like this mafia bit, a section where you're tiny and you have to jump around on books and stuff, a Godzilla-like monster movie area, and you even end up going backstage too, where the enemies are just people working on the films. God damn, this is such a good concept. There's even this pirate ship level that you explore, but then when you return in the present, it's a sunken ruin. Rascal is actually full of really good ideas like this, but they're unfortunately wasted because the game itself is bad. Speaking of the sunken ruin level though, I think it's about time that we talk about the other playstyles in the game. So, as was the case with a lot of platformers of the time, Rascal features underwater levels. And just like with a lot of the other platformers of the time, these are quite bad. Maybe that's being too harsh, because I actually think that the levels themselves are probably fine, but yet again, the tank controls and the camera are just so bad here. Potentially even worse than in the normal levels. When you're underwater, the camera just does its own thing completely. It doesn't even attempt to follow behind you anymore, and it just floats around pointing in random directions. And it can make it impossible to get a good look at your surroundings, which results in missing stuff because you're also on a constant time limit because of your limited air supply. There's also some of these slide-in sections that show up a few times, and as to be expected, these are rubbish too. They just feel really stiff, and you're always going around corners where your view is completely obstructed, and of course they'll place obstacles either on the corner or right after a corner, which gives you literally no time to react to them. It just ends up feeling really cheap, and a poor excuse to take some of your health off of you. I get that the game probably needed something to break up the standard gameplay, but these sliding sections aren't it, Chief. But let's calm down here, we're supposed to be talking about the game's positives. So I've already mentioned how I like the fact that when you lose a life, you don't actually lose any of your progress, and I do also really like the concept behind the level progression too. Let's see, what else? I guess the music is okay. It is actually quite catchy, but the problem with it is that it loops a little bit too quickly, which can make it feel a bit repetitive. There is also a little bit of an issue with inconsistency within the soundtrack. It almost feels like the different tracks from the game could have been taken from completely different projects, but here they're all found within one experience. To illustrate what I mean, let's listen to a couple of examples. Hopefully then you'll see what I'm talking about. It almost sounds like these two tracks are from completely different games. Outside of the music, the actual sound design in this game is quite bad. One of the things that actually made me laugh is that every single enemy in the game makes the exact same grunting sound effect when they're hit, regardless of what they look like, and it sometimes just comes across as a bit silly. Another stupid thing that I noticed is that every single door in the game makes the exact same squeaking sound effect, regardless of if it's a wooden door, curtains, blinds, or anything in between. But to the game's credit, I do also have this issue in my own house as well, so I guess this can be forgiven. I also do appreciate how the maps for each level are hand-drawn by Rascal as he progresses through them, and the notepad that he's using to do this on has these little doodles on the side that are related to the particular level that you're exploring. That's a nice touch. The map itself could have been more detailed though, and potentially told you when there was something that you had missed, because it was a pretty common issue that I came to the end of a level but didn't have all of the timepieces, and so needed to backtrack a lot to find something that I had missed. The map did come in handy one time though, where I was in this underwater level and I didn't know that I could swim up and down to enter new areas. So I checked the map and it actually displayed arrows implying that there was new areas for me to go to. So I suppose I've got to give the map system some credit at least. For every one thing this game does well, there's about 5 issues to go alongside it, and it's such a missed opportunity because I feel like in the right hands this could have been a good little game. But we aren't quite done here just yet because there's one more thing that we need to talk about, because yes, Rascal has boss battles. Oh my god, the boss battles. All of these are against Chronon, and every single one of them play out exactly the same. When you enter a level for a 3rd time, you're transported to the future of that level, where Chronon has taken over and a boss fight takes place. All he does is stand in place and rotates to face you, and then attempts to throw stuff at you. Then after throwing stuff, he lowers his shield, allows you to get a hit in, and then just throws more stuff at you again. So basically, all you have to do here is just run around in a circle, shoot at him, and then run around in a circle again, rinse and repeat, and you've done it. That's every boss in the game, including the final boss. It's utterly pathetic to be honest, but I guess there's not really a lot else they could do considering how basic the combat is, and how bad the controls are. Maybe there could have been some kind of platforming section where an area is flooding and you have to evade a boss. I don't know, I mean at least make the bosses visually distinct for God's sake though. At the end of the game, you rescue your dad and repair time, while also trapping Chronon in a time vortex where he'll forever remain. And that's it. Kinda predictable, but I don't really know what I was expecting. I mean, it's not like there was gonna be some kind of massive plot twist or anything, was there? Something else that Rascal does have going for it though, is that it actually runs at 60 frames a second. And while yeah, it does drop frames sometimes, it is actually pretty consistent. This officially means that Rascal is a better video game than Bloodborne, which even on the PS5 is still locked to 30 frames a second. Sorry, I don't make the rules. After all of that and finally finishing this game after all of this time, I think I can pretty much confirm why I've never done this before, and that is, quite simply, because it's bad. Who would have guessed? There's just so many issues with this game that it's actually quite ridiculous. The 1-2 punch of having a bad camera and bad controls, the clashing of mechanics where it's about exploration but then you also constantly feel rushed, the level design being pretty repetitive because every level basically just feels like a maze, and the lack of a sense of progression due to the fact that there's no overarching collectibles to be getting. Then on top of that you have stuff like the bad boss battles, and it's just like every single area of the game has something that can be heavily criticised. What I will say though is that Rascal is nowhere near as bad as people make it out to be. Like sure it is bad, but there is some attention to detail here. They did try to make the levels stand out from each other, and there are unique set pieces in some areas which make them distinct. The actual idea of playing through the same levels but in different time periods is actually really good, and it is actually executed reasonably well. It is bad, but it's nowhere near the worst game on the PS1. Hell, it's not even the worst PS1 game released in 1998. You ever hear of a game called Hugo? So, did I enjoy my time with Rascal? No. Would I recommend that you give it a go? Absolutely not. But am I glad that I've finally gotten around to completing it after all of these years? Hell yeah. Like I said way at the start of this video, this is a game that I've had since 1998, so even if I didn't enjoy it very much, I'm glad that I've finally seen everything that it's got to offer. I'm sure that there's loads of you watching this video right now that are in a similar situation to what I was, where you've got a game in your collection that you've owned for literally years, and you've just never really played it. If I'm describing you right now, then maybe give whatever game it is that you've never played a go, and even if you don't like it, you might find something about it that you can at least appreciate. For years and years, Rascal has always been that game that I've never really properly tried, but in the back of my mind I kind of knew that it wasn't very good. But now when I look at it, I can see it as being the game that has that really interesting time travel mechanic, and I'd rather see it like that than just as a game sitting on my shelf that I've never really played before. And with that, we've finally finished this video. If you enjoyed it, give it a like, subscribe to see more stuff like this coming soon, and leave a comment down below letting me know if there's any games in your collection that you've never really properly tried. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye!